So good evening, everyone, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is a real pleasure for me to welcome you here in the Mons campus of UC Louvain for the 47th ECPR joint session of workshops. I hope everyone had a pleasant trip to join us, especially those traveling from far away. I guess you all agree that the utmost quality of a welcoming address is its brevity, so I will be shorter than the 10 minutes that has been allowed to me. So let me go straight to the point. I had a look on the topics of the 30 workshops that will keep you busy for the next 3 days. They go from emotion and populism to democratic backsliding, passing by rethinking the governance of financial integration and violence against political actors. These topics deal with many of the key challenges that face our societies. They address the inconvenient truth that our democracies and the rule of law might well be much more fragile than one used to think in Western Europe these last decades. In a fairy tale world, scientific research should receive funds for the sake of human knowledge without consideration for any immediate practical outcome. Well, we do not live in a fairy tale world, and we know, and somehow we accept, that more money is devoted to discover new treatment for cancer than for, let's say, innovative multi-level forms of governance and democracy. Still, my point is political science can save lives, many lives. Let me illustrate that statement by an example chosen in my own field of research, that is international peace and security. A recent study conducted by a US think tank shows that during the last 4 years, the low-profile policy of local ceasefire implemented by the UN Special Envoy in Syria, Staffan de Mistura, probably saved around 300,000 souls. 300,000 souls. Sadly enough, history is thankless. It will certainly recall that de Mistura's mission was a perfect failure, as he did not succeed to gather successful peace talks. The fact, though, is that the implementation of sophisticated peacemaking techniques and astute negotiating skills enabled to lower the death toll of the Syrian conflict. Coming back to the workshop of the coming days, it strikes me that they clearly deal with issues that are inherent to democracy itself and seem to have deadly effect on the very system that produces them. In this respect, they appear as the equivalent of cancer or autoimmune disease of our contemporary political systems. Understanding these processes and finding ways to reverse them is an important endeavor, and I wish your discussions here in Mons would be fruitful in this regard. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcoming a joint session of workshop is a real honor. The UC Louvain is grateful to ECPR authorities for having trusted our institution. It is also a huge organizational challenge that relies on the full dedication of many people, institutions, and sponsors. In this regard, I am grateful for the support given by the Association belge francophone de sciences politiques, l'École des sciences politiques et sociales de l'UC Louvain, la Fédération Wallonie-Bruxelles, le Fonds de la recherche scientifique, la Haute École Louvain en Endo, l'Institut de sciences politiques Louvain-Europe, la Wallonie et l'UC Louvain FUCAM Mons. And last but not least the host city, La Ville de Mons, that welcomes you today. A very special thank to the local organizing committee, Elena Aoun, Cristela Babic, Pierre Bodowens, Camila Carvalho, Irena de Greve, Marta Galina, Laura Pascolo, Mine Rechamp, and Cécile Rich. Also, many thanks to the ECPR focal point, Marcia Taylor, and to the administrative and logistic support staff here on the UC Louvain campus in Mons. I wish you all a very fruitful 47th joint session of workshop, and I have the great pleasure to leave the floor to the ECPR chair, Professor Chris de Scouwer. Thank you very much.
Cher Michel Liégeois, Président de l'ISPOL, dear colleagues, dear ECPR community, it is for me also a great pleasure to welcome you to the 47th edition of the joint sessions of workshops here in Mons, on the Mons campus of the UC Louvain. It is also, for me personally, it is a bit special. I mean, I have to tell you, it is a bit special. This is the first time that in my capacity of chair of ECPR, I have the opportunity to welcome the participants in the joint sessions, and it happens to be at home. I'm in my home country, and Belgium is so small that wherever you are, you're always close to home. So for me, it's special. I mean, I can welcome you to my place, so to say, although I'm not from University of Mons. I can also welcome you to Belgium. Belgium has so far 3 times organized the joint sessions. We were in Antwerp in 2012, if I remember well, and we were in 1976 at the Université Catholique de Louvain. Even I do not remember that anymore, but we have already been in Louvain, but at another campus, and at a time where the university was still called in full Université Catholique de Louvain. You might have seen that the name and the brand has slightly changed to UC Louvain. So thank you for doing it a second time, and if you have more campuses to show to us, we will be very glad to come back, because ECPR always organizes its events in close collaboration with member organizations and on the premises, on the campuses of these members. And if one of your university is eager or willing to organize, to host one of our events, do tell us. We will be very glad to talk to you and see what we can do for you. We are very grateful, of course, as ECPR, we are very grateful that we are here in Mons, because we need local hosts for organizing events like this. And without the very valuable contribution and efforts of a local team, events like this would never happen. And I would, on behalf of ECPR, like to repeat the names again of all the people who have put their effort and their work into this, and invite you to thank them on behalf also of ECPR. Elena Aoun, Pierre Boudewijns, Mine Rechamp, Cristela Babic, Camila Carvalho, Irene de Greve, Marta Galina, Laura Pascolo, Cécile Rich, and not to forget all the red T-shirts, well actually the students inside the red T-shirts, for helping us around the campus, for showing us where to go. From the bottom of my heart, thank you very much. And while I'm still standing here, I seize the opportunity to also extend my personal thanks to the events team of the ECPR in Harbour House in Colchester, led by Rebecca Locke, who is here, and with the great effort, great contribution of Mrs. Joint Sessions, Marcia Taylor. Thanks a lot for what you're doing for us. And there's many more. There's people in the executive committee, and in particular Ignazio De Santis for preparing the joint session, academic content of it. Della Porta for the Stein Rokkan lecture, and also, last but not least, all the workshop directors who are the real academic conveners of the joint sessions of workshop. We are extremely grateful that you all make this happen. And all I need to do now, before leaving the floor to Ignazio De Santis for the Wildermann Prize, is wish you a very, very great workshop and a great joint sessions of workshops. Thanks a lot.
The Rudolf Wildermann Prize was established in 1997 and is presented on an annual basis to a scholar who presented an outstanding paper at the previous ECPR joint session of workshops. 21 nominations were shortlisted after the Nicosia joint sessions, and the jury awarded the 2018 Rudolf Wildermann Prize to Philipp Lutz of the University of Bern. The jury was composed by myself, Maurizio Carbone, Oddbjørn Knudsen, Reven Hazan, Emiliano Grossman. The winning paper is entitled Dynamic Partisan Effects in Migration Policy. Philipp's article analyzed the effects of partisanship on migration policies over time. Immigration is commonly considered as a cross-cutting issue which divides mainstream parties internally. However, given the increased politicization of the issue in electoral competition and the subconstant realignment of a West European party system, one would accept increasing partisan divides with more distinct policies between left and right-wing governments. Over the same time, economic globalization and political internationalization have increasingly limited the policy space for national governments. Philip's article tests the politicization and the globalization hypothesis with a cabinet-based data set of migration policy changes from 1980 to 2040 across 18 West European countries. His results show the dynamic nature of partisanship and confirm the realignment of migration policies with increasing divergence between left-wing and right-wing governments over time. However, his results also show substantial variation between different dimensions of migration policy. In immigration policy, governments implemented more liberal policies over time, independent of government ideology. In integration policy, the study finds significant polarization over time. Philip's finds provide important insight into the dynamics of partisan effects and migration policy making in time of globalization. The theme of Philip's paper is topical with broad relevance to the concerns of the discipline, and it makes an important contribution to existing scholar literature on the dynamics of partisan influence in migration policy. Philip's paper is focused, methodologically strong and well written and constructed. His conclusions suggest a rich vein of research for future exploration. The ECPR offers Philip its congratulations on a well-deserved achievement.
There are some people who do not need to be presented. Professor Della Porta is one of them. A long presentation of her is needless, and therefore I shall very soon leave the floor to her, so don't worry. But on behalf of the local organizing committee, I would like to share 3 brief comments. First, it is an honor and a privilege to have Della Porta as a Stein Rokkan lecturer here in Mons. Not only is she a distinguished scholar, but also she has also been one of the local organizers of the 2016 joint session in Pisa. Donatella Della Porta is indeed a woman of action, but everybody can see this, as you merely observe of CV. Over 90 books, even more articles and book chapters. In 2018, she has received the Mattei Dogan Prize for distinguished achievements in the field of political sociology. She's also held honorary doctorates from the universities of Lausanne, Bucharest, Göteborg, and in Jyväskylä. In a nutshell, her contribution to the field of political research is tremendous, and she is a constant source of inspiration for many of us. Our lecture of today questions democratic innovation in intense time and suggests to bring Stein Rokkan back in for understanding cleavages in a moment of crisis. This topic is developed in a forthcoming book. It's a bit of a commercial ad, if you wish, on how social movements can save democracy, to be published in Polity Press in 2020. This is, of course, a topical theme, and this theme also echoes cost action, constitution making, and deliberative democracy, of which Donatella Della Porta is a member. This cost action is sponsoring the lecture that is now about to begin. But in a very democratic fashion, after the lecture, there will be a Q&A session with this microgroup, so be alive and be ready to discuss and interact with Donatella Della Porta. Thank you very much again for having accepted our invitation. The floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, Min, and thank you very much to the ECPR. It is an honor for me, a great honor, and especially I am a generation of joint sessions. When I was thinking about this presentation, I was thinking about my first attendance at the ECPR, which was the first of a long series, and it was more than 30 years ago. And the joint sessions, I think, are the most original and most helpful democratic innovations of the ECPR long ago, and I wish them long life. So in this presentation, I wanted to give an homage to Stein Rokkan, but also to rethink our theories of cleavages, which are theories that are usually oriented to explain the freezing of party politics and party systems, can be helpfully revisited in order to look at the moment which is a moment of quick changes. And my presentation is also an homage of Min and the cost action addressing this topic, but it is also an attempt to bring in some hope. It was said just a few minutes ago by Michel Lijoise, political studies can save life. And I think they can save politics, but we have to look together with the big challenges, also maybe at the examples of something which is moving in right directions. So I want to bridge in these lectures these two topics. On the one hand, how can we revisit Rokkan in order to try to explain times of changes, right, rather than times of stability. And the second is to which extent can we learn if we look at examples of democratic innovations that are I must say, examples on the way of addressing the challenges that have been mentioned a few minutes ago and that are going to be mentioned in all these days. So the first observations from which my lecture starts is that in order to look at our times, which are times of crisis and challenges to democracies, we may go back to some of the original way in which Stein Rokkan has been thinking about cleavages. Stein Rokkan has been thinking about the main cleavages in our societies. I don't think I have to go very much in depth in this presentation because it is the most known contributions of Stein Rokkan when he said there are four main cleavages that structured party politics. Two are related with national revolutions. One is the cleavages between central national building cultures and the subject populations, center-periphery cleavages, the nation state and the church. And two cleavages are related with the development of industrial revolution. So landed interest versus industrial entrepreneurs, owners and labor. So these are the four cleavages around which all those of us who have been studied social movements or party politics have been reflecting in terms of how politics had structured and stabilized these cleavages. Stefano Bertolini and Peter Mayer have studied the way in which three dimensions of the cleavages have interacted. The empirical dimensions of the cleavages, so the social structural references, the sense of identity, so the normative dimensions of the cleavages, and what they call the organizational, behavioral element of the cleavages. So the ways in which, especially political parties, contributed to stabilize some types of cleavages and introducing them, freezing them within the party system. Social movement studies, which is the type of literature I've been mostly referring in my own work, has done parallel type of contributions. So if you think at another big scholars, important scholars like Charles Tilly, he has been studied conflicts along the same line. So according to Charles Tilly, the main development in conflicts in our societies happen also during the two very same processes that Stein Rokkan mentioned. On the one hand, the development of the state, of the nation state, and on the other hand, the development of capitalism. And so in both cases, these two scholars are telling us that we have to look at moments of changes and the ways in which they become then path dependence, we can say, in producing and stabilizing conflict lines within our societies. The type of process that, or causal mechanisms through which these stabilizations happen was related with the activations of what Peter Mayer and Stefano Bartolini called translators of cleavages into party politics. So political parties that functioned as organizations that structured through the development of norms the type of conflicts happening within societies. I define processes of identification, structurations, and the politizations of cleavages and mobilizations as processes that helped to stabilize this loop, to stabilize the political parties that we saw active in our societies. this is what Stein Rokkan and Chastili studied. The way in which we looked at them is especially within two types of temporality that another big scholars, William Sewell, define as teleological and experimental type of temporalities. It means the analysis of cleavages were mainly embedded in the observations that in a teleological way events are explained on the basis of transhistorical processes. So we have been looking, for instance, at Stein Rokkan or at Charles Tilly, thinking about the type of processes of democratizations, urbanizations, industrializations that brought about the stabilizations of the cleavages. Another type of temporality that William Sewell described is the type of experimental temporality. Stein Rokkan has been also looked at in order to distinguish within different party systems the way in which different types of cleavages have been more or less absorbed within the class cleavages, which has been considered as at the basis of the distinctions between the right and the left, but in different ways in different societies and party systems with the survival of some of the old cleavages in different forms in different countries. My claim in this lecture is that we could also look at the contributions of Stein Rokkan by considering the third type of temporality that William Sewell singled out, and it is a more dynamic type of temporality. So Sewell said, eventful temporality recognizes the power of events in history. So his contributions of Stein Rokkan could be seen in the freezing of cleavages, but also in the dynamics of the cleavages. And I think that nowadays, since we all, as political scientists and political sociologists, recognize that we are in times of fast changes, we are in times for sure not of stability, I think that revisiting the contributions of Stein Rokkan in terms of how cleavages are addressed in these interactions of social conflicts, normative development, and the political organizations of the cleavages could be a good way to try to understand the challenges and maybe to address these challenges. So reading Rokkan through Sewell also means trying to, I think, understand how in the challenges that are developing nowadays, we could see cleavages that we had considered as pacified, frozen, overcome to a certain extent, as opening again, as reactivating themselves. The Yellow Vest in the various developments have been seen also as a sign of reopening of one of the first cleavages that has been addressed by Rokkan, the cleavages of the city versus the countryside. But there are also our cleavages which are reopened in recent time. Cleavages between the center and the periphery that have been studied by Stein Rokkan and Irwin and others are cleavages that has been considered for a long time overcome, at least in advanced democracies, at least in Europe, and yet are instead reactivated in very dramatic form. And once again with an interaction between the social type of interest, the normative dimension of the cleavage, and the organizational structure of the cleavages. The same is true of the type of conflicts around religion and the state. So recently in Italy we had huge marches and demonstrations on the issues of gender rights, in which some fundamentalist Christian groups mobilized against rights which seems to have been acquired, and testifying of revitalizations of religions outside of the sphere of private life in which it seems to be confined. And finally, and most important also to a certain extent in all the reflections about Rokkan, the class cleavage has been redeveloping in the type of evolutions after during and after the austerity crisis. So we have been reactivating this cleavage through several types of processes that happen in the streets or in the squares of these type of movements, but fighting against austerities, but also processes that to a large extent brought about some examples of innovations, democratic innovations that even though are at the moment just, illustrations, examples, experiments is the terms which is often used. However, they seems to me to work sometimes as an event in the logic of the eventful temporality of William Sewell in setting up processes of diffusions of ideas, and especially testifying the potentials for alternative conceptions of democracy in times of crisis. So the cleavages are reopening. Some scholars talk about new cleavages, like between the Gal and the TAN, or between populist and non-populist parties. I think I'm more conservative in Rokkanian terms, in believing more in the old cleavages. But what is sure is that the story of the cleavages is not just a story in which we can look at one moment in which they were formed, but we have to look also at the different moments in which they are reopening, and that also the directions in which struggles around these four main cleavages go is the most important thing when we think about how much democracy is challenged by this, and how much instead this type of conflicts could develop into strengthening rather than challenging democracy. So it's time of crisis, it seems to me, that have tended to produce attempt to overcome the challenges by going beyond what Robert Dahl called the minimalistic definition of democracy. Another big scholars who just died, David Held, said, as political scientists, we have been accustomed in looking at the existing democracy, what Dahl called the really existing democracies, and identifying democracy with what we saw in them. But in a moment of challenges, it could be useful to go back to the many definitions of democracy that political theorists have been looking at, and seeing also the ways in which majoritarian definitions of democracy, representative definitions of democracies as based on delegations, could also be combined with other democratic qualities, which are rather stressing the importance of participation and the importance of deliberation. So not only the importance of voting, but also the importance of opening up different type of arenas in which conflicts could be addressed, not resolved, but addressed in a democratic way. So in this moment, what we saw, eventful temporality in the definitions of William Sewell, was crisis. There has been recently several research looking at the ways in which the economic crisis, financial crisis first of all, but then the so-called refugees crisis, and nowadays the Brexit crisis, have a big impact on the development of our democracies. These crises have shaken the political legitimacy of representative democracies, but if I want to also keep some hope, and in some weeks there is hope that is emerging with some good electoral results in Slovakia or in Chicago or big protests going in the direction of inclusive and just system. Well, I think that we can consider that in this time, what this crisis and the movements that followed have produced has been also some ideas for a revitalization of democracies, which is what Min and the Cost Group are studying, and it is something that I think could be helpful to look at bridging different types of theories in different areas of political science and sociology. And this I want to do on the basis of some assumptions which I think are resonant with Stein Rokkan's message, which is that we cannot look at politics only on the basis of the assumptions that the political is an autonomous sphere, but we have to bridge the political also with the development of the society. And that democratization processes are central, as they were in the development of Stein Rokkan thought, and that this type of development of democracies implies what Stein Rokkan called the overcoming of thresholds. So processes of democratizations are not processes of autonomizations of the institutions, but rather processes in which the type of what Piero Sanvallon called counter-democracies, the type of controls on the governance and on the governors can develop in different ways. So the assumption is also that in times of crisis, rather than considering citizens as unfit for democratic developments, we could see at examples of type of democratic innovations in which citizens have been trusted as actors that can participate in the solutions of conflicts and development of new ideas. And in the analysis of social movements and in the analysis of political sociology in general, we've been accustomed to see social movements as actors that produce ideas, but that are usually considered as at the gate of the political system. So the title of a book by Sidney Tarrow, an important scholar in bridging politics and society, was called At the Gate, and assumed a sort of Estonian type of mechanisms in which social movements raised claims and other actors channel them inside the society, inside the Estonian black box. What I think happened during the crisis was that very often social movements and citizens tended to enter into institutions. And I want to make 3 examples of ways in which responses to the crisis developed in the directions of claims for more participation of the citizens and more consensual forms of democracy in a type of participations that were not only the participation in the streets, but also the type of forms of participation that have been most valued in political science research on institution buildings. One is constitutionalism and the so-called crowdsourced constitutionalism. Another one is referendums and the different forms that they can take from the high to low qualities, but also the attempt, and in some cases the development of what I called referendums from below, and finally the development of new parties in a moment in which we thought the party time is over, and instead we saw the development of parties very much related with social movements. So crowdsources constitutional process. I knew very little about constitutionalism, but when I started to study anti-austerity protest and I looked at the Icelandic case, what emerged as very interesting was the claim by the movements that developed against the ICE-safe referendums during the breakdown of the Icelandic banks. The claim that not only in this moment of crisis you need constitutions, but also that in order to make these constitutions able to re-establish a sort of social pact in the society, you also need constitutions that are participated by the people. And when I started to read literature on constitutionalism, I also noticed how this type of processes that I was looking at from the point of view of social movement studies were quite widespread. In fact, constitutionalists talked of an accelerated time of constitutionalism, but they also talked at a sort of change of paradigm in the development of constitutions that for a long time were considered to be just technical issues and now are instead more and more reflected upon and constructed as a political type of decisions in which sort of emancipatory issues are sometimes developed. And the interesting thing is that from Iceland, which is, as you know, Iceland, a small country, this idea started to travel. They traveled within political science, and David Farrell is one of the translators of these ideas in other countries. They traveled, for instance, to Ireland. And they traveled on the basis of some specific ideas that constitutions can be legitimating new agreements if they are participated. So a model of building constitutions through participations of the people that are usually chosen by lot or elected, but also deliberative processes in which on the basis of Habermasian, the constructions of Habermasian public spheres, new ideas about the basic fundamental norms can be created. And in fact, crowdsourced, what has been called crowdsourcing, sense of crowdsourcing the ideas that then entered this type of constitutional process, are based on assumptions which are considered as breaking the old assumptions about constitutionalism as a technical issues oriented to create the best equilibrium between institutions and guarantee of political and civic rights for the people, and instead considering the contested nature of constitutions, but also the participated need for constitutions in order to be legitimate, and the importance of constitutions to create inclusive norms in the society. Another example of the ways in which I think during the crisis, the financial crisis that has been translated into a crisis of legitimacy, also social movements and ideas of participatory and deliberative democracies have entered institutions through the use of quite established channels of political participation. There are very different types of referendums. Scholars of referendum say we are also here seeing a sort of accelerated development of referendums, and we know that referendums have very different qualities, going from plebiscites with very little participation of the people in the debate, very elite-driven type of debate, referendums that brings about very, say, dramatic changes like in the Brexit cases. But there are also referendums that have been important in the participations that they've allowed to the people, and the type of capacity to build broad type of arenas and contribute to this sense of empowerment and participation. The Scottish referendum on independence is an example, but there is also an example from my own country, from which very few good examples come, but this is one of them. And it was a referendum against the privatizations of water supply that mobilized in 2011 more than 50% of the electorate, which is the threshold that you have to overcome in order for referendums to be valid, and which was not overcome for decades. And with 98% of the citizens claiming they were against the privatizations of water supply. What is interesting in studying this type of referendums is that they seem to have been able to develop not only very broad type of participation up to bringing to the electoral votes many citizens, but also to develop spheres of public spheres, arenas of participation, so that even when sometimes the aims of the movements that promoted the referendums or of the movements that sort of squatted the referendums are not achieved, there is anyhow a sense of empowerment that seems to be able to survive and seems to be able to nurture conceptions of democracy which are more participatory and deliberative. So I'm not saying that all the referendums are good, far from that. Scholars of referendums have been studying a lot the different qualities of different referendums. But I think that there are, in these reactions to the challenges produced by the financial crisis, austerity politics, and so on, also a reactivation of these forms of direct democracy, which could contribute, not alone, but in combinations with other forms of democracy, to address those challenges. And once again, like in the crowdsourced constitutional process, I think that this could happen through the creations of plural type of arenas, of a politicization, a debate about the type of cleavages. So referendums from below, for instance, I've defined as referendums called by the citizens or infiltrated by citizens' organizations that are based, capable of developing sort of mass campaign and creating several spaces for debate, and referendums which are also emancipatory in their process, so not only in their aims, but also in the ways in which they create active participation by the citizens. Last point I want to make, last example I want to give is the example of new political parties. This is a poster by Barcelona en Comú, which has been governing the city of Barcelona for 5 years now, or something like that. But other political parties have emerged. The case of Slovakia is just one of these. And this has been quite a surprise for social movement scholars, because they've been emerging from social movements that were most skeptic about institutional politics, that were most critical of political parties as they were, that succeeded in creating deep crisis in existing tendentially bipartisan party system, and to introduce new elements. My claim here would be that notwithstanding all this skepticism towards party politics, this movement has been contributing to legitimate political parties and to create some new ideas, or developing some new forms that could be studied in the Stein Rokkan type of perspective. So movement parties as ideal type could be defined as those organizations that participate in protest campaigns, but also participate at the electoral level, that address movements' constituencies by creating channels of participations, and that represent movements type of claim. And what we have seen has been that, like in a sort of hydraulic type of system, the empty spot within political parties, the strong on the left created, for instance, by the strong decline of center-left parties, have been very often filled in by new political parties that tried to develop some ideas. I'm not claiming that all the ideas were successful, but that in a system in which political parties, according to all our studies, were going in the direction of detaching themselves from the society and approaching the state, as in the case of cartel parties. This represents sort of counter tendency that we have to see to which extent could be sustained in the future, but reintroduce some ideas about the reasons for failures of old parties and the ways in which some different developments can be fueled. And this happened within protest wave against austerities that have been generating contentious political cultures, that have politicized everyday life, that have created sort of anti-establishment frame, but that have been challenged in constitutions, referendums, and in political parties themselves. I want to reach final part of my presentations and going back to which type of concepts we have in order to try to address this times of changes. I think that one of the main observations is that everything is challenged. Cleavages are reopening and so on. And there are several concepts in political science, sociology, in the study of democracy and in the study of social movements that I think could contribute in defining these times. One of these is critical junctures. So neo-institutionalism, I think, has given an important contributions in thinking about stable democracy, but it started to contribute also a lot to our understanding of critical junctures as moments in which changes do not happen gradually and incrementally, but rather happens in a sudden way. How critical junctures in the study of David Collier's and others are related to moment of institutional innovations that are, to a certain extent, responding to lack of capacity of institutions not only to function well, but also to reform themselves in a gradual and incremental way. So, type of discontinuous political change in which critical junctures dislodge all the institutional patterns. And Ken Roberts, studying political parties in Latin America, has also connected the critical junctures to moment of crisis. And I think these conceptions of crisis could be extremely useful in order to reflect about our time as times in which different type of potential development through rapid changes can happen. What are these times made of? There is a term like backlash, which is re-emerging often, and this pointing at the fact that these are times in which negative trends are emerging. There is for sure a development of conservative, exclusivist forms of nationalism. There are many types of challenges that have been mentioned, from right-wing populism to the development of racism and so on. But these are also times of repolitizations. Chantal Mouffe has been one of the scholars who has been reflecting on times of changes as times in which there is a return of the political. And I think that beyond the debatable conceptions of left-wing populism that she proposed, the fact that the crisis is bringing about politizations is an observation that could be supported from a lot of empirical evidence. And something which I think she's right in pointing at is also that in this moment of return of the political, the reflections about democracy is particularly central. In this type of development and in type of conceptions that I think would be useful in order to think about our time, there is also the reflection about the different types of times, for instance, by Mark Basinger, that in looking at nationalism distinguish between a type of time which is very much related with stability, and instead the accelerations of time that happen in moment of crisis, in which turning points happen, shocks, breaking points, and deep type of transformations. These are the times that Antonio Gramsci defined as time of interregnum. He wrote, the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And the morbid symptoms are the challenges that have been described, but the times of crisis are also times in which other types of development can happen. And in fact, when thinking about our times, I was also thinking about the contributions of Guglielmo O'Donnell and Philip Schmidt that were looking at time of democratic transition. In their case, it was especially the constructions of democracies, but I think we can apply this same type of reflections nowadays. And these were time that they define as understructured. So times in which the normal rules that are also the rules that we as political scientists have observed in our work are no longer functioning. They are no longer able to structure their reality. If we think in terms of rational choice theories, if you want to act, you have to imagine what the others will be doing. In times of crisis, this is very difficult because you lose the capacity to predict what the others will be doing. But also in terms of macro structures, time of changes, type of sudden breaks, times of crisis are the times in which old institutions are no longer able to function as they used to be. And so I think this requires also adaptations in the way in which we looked at this type of times. Times of crisis, times of accelerations of history are challenging times, but there are also times in which contingency is relevant. So it could be that from one week to the next, you have big changes in the politics and the societies. And there are also times in which agency is more capable of intervening on structures. Going back to Sewell, these are times in which events can create structures rather than structures constraining the events that tend to happen. So I think that probably my time is almost over, 5 minutes to go. I think that it is important to reflect on this type of examples exactly because in times of crisis we can imagine a way through which reopening effective, high quality public spheres and trusting the citizens, we can make conflicts enriching societies rather than disrupting democracies. So with this talk, I wanted to contribute to this type of, I can say, move towards the study of democratic innovations for below, considering how democratic, participatory and deliberative democracy can help addressing the challenges of the great regression and the capacity to overcome what Zygmunt Bauman called the retrotopic nostalgia on the right. So these are times in which I think that this type of developments can help us reflecting on under which conditions the calls for a cultural sovereignty of the ethnic majority can be contrasted through the development of institutions in which solidarity can be rebuilt and societies can be revitalized. In this space, recognitions could develop. I want to cite a last quote from an important sociologist, Alessandro Pizzorno. He noted that the original resource a human being can offer to another is the capacity to recognize the worth of the other to exist, a resource that cannot be produced if it is not shared. Recognizing the other human being as an end in itself and recognizing the same human beings as a means to the end of preserving oneself are as being united. The good of self-preservation is achieved when mutual recognition between human beings is achieved. So you observe the presence of other people is necessary for acting before becoming a possible means for individual ends. The interactions with the others appears as an end in itself. With this theory of recognitions, Alessandro Pizzorno contributed, I think, most important insights about the importance of the building of solidarity and reciprocal type of recognitions. He left us a few days ago at the age of 95, and it is to him as a master and a friend for me and many others that I want to dedicate this lecture. Thank you very much. This is a democratic innovation, by the way. Let's see if it works.
Well, thank you very much, Della Porta, for this very inspiring lecture. So the floor is now yours for a few minutes. While you get ready for questions you might have, I would like to thank again, the team, administrative team of this university, but also of the Della, on the same campus as the building, led by Martin Gérard. So many thanks to those of them as well. I will throw this. I can either do it by lot, so I send it around, but I can also target somebody who would like to ask a question. And just to reassure those people, there will be shuttle buses leaving at 7:15 on the Ella building. So the schedule is all planned, so you can have a few minutes here for the Q&A sessions, and we can leave all together on the shuttle buses to the reception. So if you stay here, you still have some bonus. Anyone for a question? Oh, yeah.
You always need sometimes for democratic innovations to work.
Yeah, thank you very much for a fascinating, very interesting presentation. Matthias Thiemann, Sciences Po Paris. I have two questions. One is, right now in the Grand Débat in France, we're experiencing possibly a democratic experiment that goes very much along the lines that you mentioned. But the huge question is how to draw conclusions from mass participations that represent what was actually going on in these debates. And I have no answer to that, but as you can now observe, whatever Macron will do, and I'm not sure he'll do the right thing, it will be framed by his opponents as a smokescreen, reading out of it, whatever he wants to read out of it, which is, so I'll try to raise the question of legitimacy of mass participation and how you see that. And the second one is the movement parties that you mentioned, and here I would like to mention my colleague Caterina Froio from Sciences Po. She's studying a movement party from the right in Italy. I'm not sure if they're called Fratelli d'Italia, but they are this really right-wing party that is a movement party. So these phenomena evidently are not limited to the left wing of society. So I was wondering if you could also reflect on that. Thank you.
Thank you for these questions. I know Caterina's work well. We were colleagues. And your questions allow me also to make specifications. I don't want to say that all the type of trends that are developing are trends that naturally go in the directions of creating a more inclusive and just societies and political system. And this is why I think we have to study them, because we have to be able to understand under which conditions this type of experiments and turn and twist in democracy can go in the directions of developing an inclusive societies, and under which conditions they either failed or even go in the opposite type of directions. So I think also very often the ideas of creating deliberative space is developed in an instrumental way and quite late. So now, for instance, I've read about the ideas to address the strong cleavages in the UK between those who want to remain and those who want the Brexit through public debates organized a bit like the Irish examples on the Constitution. This, I think, is an idea of Gordon Brown. I think that under these conditions it is extremely difficult to develop sort of high-quality discursive democracy. And this is a problem with this type of democratic innovations that sometimes are thought about as a sort of last resort rather than being embedded in a long-term process. On the other hand, because of contingency and agency, sometimes even this type of developments could be squatted, occupied by more inclusive type of forces and oriented in the right directions. Other things about movement parties, there are books also on the right-wing movement parties. I think that also there what is important to try to define is the different type of purposes of the parties themselves. So I would, as you can have parties on the left and parties on the right, you can have also, of course, movement parties on both sides. The challenge is to define them, because in a world in which the categories of left and right are sometimes contexted and sometimes blurred, it's difficult to say who is a subject going in a more emancipatory direction and who is not. Normative theorist debates about how much we can even use the terms of progressive, which is a term which has been considered as very much colonial in its meaning. But I think that we need to study both. And so I think one of the limits in social movement studies was exactly that very few, besides Caterina or Pietro Castelli or others, were working on the right wing. I think it's very important to work on those challenges. But I think it's also important to empirically look at processes in which you can have also, for instance, referendums that are starting as institutional type of move, like the one on Scotland, sort of penetrated from below and becoming more spaces for politizations and reopening of debate. Thank you for your question.
There is one volunteer over there.
Where? Oh, I'm good. Okay. Thank you very much for your inspiring speech. I have two short questions. One is about polarization. On the other side of the Atlantic, there is a discussion that polarization breeds conditions that authoritarian leaders or wannabe authoritarian leaders can exploit to break down democratic institutions or even undermine democracy. I have in mind the book by Levitsky and Ziblatt about how democracies die. To which extent you think that the rise of social movements, including movements that you're sympathetic with, are actually laying down the conditions that of polarization and conflict, which authoritarian leaders or leaders who want to strengthen executive power can take advantage of, especially if those movements are still minority, don't enjoy widespread popularity. And the second question that I have is about cleavages. To which extent do you believe political agency can manipulate cleavages, activating some or shifting the agenda and public attention to other cleavages? And to my mind, one of the key words that come is Brexit, essentially, in the aftermath of austerity and the financial crisis that completely shifted the terms of debate in Britain along the in and out debate. Thank you.
Are there any other questions so we know how we fare in terms of deliberation? No more questions so far?
Yes. Thank you for both questions. Well, let's go back to Rokkan. So cleavages means lines of conflicts. So conflicts are there in our societies. Politics is based on the existence of these conflicts, and democracy is a way to make these conflicts not too disruptive for the political system. I think rather than polarizations, I would talk, like Chantal Mouffe does, about politizations, because one of the ideas that developed not since Rokkan, much later than Rokkan, was the idea that politics had to escape conflicts, that it was just a matter of good administration. Terms like econocracy or epistocracy have been used to say we would be much better off if we were governed by the experts and would not be at risk of the emotions of the masses. So this type of approaches that see the emotional dimensions as inappropriate for politics. I think that this has been a parenthesis that now is being challenged also in our way of thinking about politics. What we saw is that that idea that politics can stay away from conflicts was or is more and more considered as unrealistic. Politics is always a choice, and so conflicts are the essence of politics. This is also, and as in Rokkan work, the problem is not that there are those conflicts. The problem is how to deal with them, how to structure them in politics. The message that I also take from Rokkan is that the structurations of these cleavages within political community is not problematic per se for democracy. To the contrary, democracy is developed through this type of structurations, either in the pillarized system of consensual democracies or in the Westminster system. So it is the creation of political communities, of these communities of solidarity that Pizzorno talked about, of the recognition and so on. Of course, there is, you used the terms of manipulating. The message of Rokkan as I read it is there are cleavages and they are politicized, filtered, translated in the terms that Peter May and Stefano Bartolini used. So it is not the manipulations, but the recognitions that no social cleavage emerges only from the oppositions of economic interest. To the contrary, I think the politicization of the cleavage is what allows for constructive interactions between different type of interest and so on. So it is not the manipulations, but it is cleavages are constructed, are imagined as nations are imagined. But this is not the problem. The problem, to the contrary, Cleavages means that you go from a conceptions of the selfish individuals into a conceptions of collective identities. And this, I think, is the positive aggregative type of elements. Of course, polarizations could bring about instead a breakdown of democracies, but it's not depolitizations per se. Thank you.
One last person who wants to touch the
You see, democratic innovations do not need much time to be.
Yeah, two questions. One comment, one question. The comment is, I'm sure last night you promised not to use the B word during your lecture today, but I heard it, and I'm sure everybody else did.
I had already had many beers.
The question is, relates to the critical junctures literature that you're arguing is useful to understand the period. Correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of that literature is that it is based on an assumption about the way in which, as you explained, political change proceeds. That is, for the most part, it's gradual and evolutionary, and this, of course, comes from a lot of political history, political historians. And then it's interrupted by a critical juncture, after which there is a return to certain stabilities. I'm just wondering about the time span here and whether there's an issue. You say we're in intense times, and I suspect everybody feels that we are. But of course, this dates back to 2008, and it's a decade. How do you foresee, if you're claiming or arguing that we're going through a critical juncture, is there an issue about the timeline? How long can that proceed? Do you foresee us returning to certain new stabilities? Because that's what's often argued. I was involved in quite an intense debate about the so-called Italian transition, where I felt that a lot of Italian political scientists had gone astray in arguing that the Italian political system was undergoing transition in the early 90s. And we ended up 20 years later with a so-called transition that had never finished, and now, many argue, never even began. I'm just wondering whether there might be an analogy there with what you're suggesting here.
Thank you, Martin. In fact, in the definition of critical junctures, one of the elements is path dependency. So the fact that the critical juncture produces a sudden change that then becomes path dependent, so become stabilized. In how long, I think, is an open issue, also because neo-institutionalists were looking at policy type of transformations, so the time span sometimes was quite short. But if we think about critical junctures and democratizations, if we think at first democratization, so the ones that were studied by Rokkan or Della, it was very long processes. So it lasted, I have in mind this scheme by Stein Rokkan about the overcoming of the different thresholds of representation. It took decades of centuries until when the women were allowed to vote. So it was a century. Now, I don't think it's going to be so long, but I think that some decades will be necessary in order to see some of these new ideas about democracy more becoming more path dependent, becoming more stabilized. But I don't want to make prediction. I don't believe political scientists should. Thank you.
Well, I would like to invite you to thank again Donatella Della Porta for this lecture. and also join us to the reception. So you can take the shuttle buses or walk to the city center. But as soon as the shuttle buses will get there, the reception will start at the Ancien Abattoir. Thanks again.